Today, I want to talk a little bit about workshop because I think that several of you are really ready to start taking advantage of the workshopping over in Annotate or if you're sharing files with one another. So, I want to go over some information. And the first thing I want to talk about is what is your purpose for workshopping? If all you are looking for is a blessing, which means you just want to hear how great you are, to a certain extent, that's fine. We need to know that we're good writers. But I would caution you on completely discounting what the critiquer has to say. Several years ago, I was teaching community writing classes at the public library, and we had a guy who wrote an epic space opera. And he would each person would get 20 minutes and they would read a piece for 10 minutes and then we get 10 minutes of feedback. And the feedback is good for everybody because you notice more about the ways in which other writers use techniques, and it teaches you to be a stronger writer. And so we have that balance of you get 10 minutes to read and 10 minutes of feedback. And there's always positive feedback because we do need that. But if that's all you want, then you're cheating yourself of that other element and you're not being honest with yourself about your purpose. So this writer that joined our group late, he would read for 19 minutes because he didn't really want us to give him feedback. He just wanted a minute of accolades. He wanted that blessing. And so one of the things I'd caution against is judging the critiquer instead of the critique. In other words, make sure that you're open to criticism, and if you're not, maybe you need to look at why you're not open to criticism. Criticism improves the work. That's a huge part. I went through an MFA program where we did in-person workshops, and you don't always get the feedback that you're looking for, but you do get good feedback if you're willing to put your ego aside. So consider that as we move into the revision stage. And so I'm going to walk you through some things that my content editor looks for so that you can begin to do those same things for the people that you are critiquing. The number one temptation when you're critiquing another writer's work is to fix it, to make it like we would write. Strangely, the better the writing, the more involved we are in fixing it because it's a kind of an exciting process. But it's not our job to write the book for another writer. It's our job to point out strengths and challenges and let the writer fix the piece in a way that befits their personal goals and their personal writing style. As a background, I have 2 editors. Actually, I've worked with 4 because every time I turn in a book, I have a new editor. That's very common in the book publishing industry. They change quite frequently. And they each have their own styles. And we're going to use the process of my content editor because that's where you're going to find the most help in your earlier or heavier revisions. As a background, there's many editing stations, if you will, in the publication process. And the first one is the content editor. So this is after you've had maybe a revise and resubmit letter, and now you have a contract. And the first thing they're going to do is you're going to get a content edit. In one publisher, the content editor is the same as the next editor, but we'll see. So you've got content edits, and then you have the managing editor then reads that revision, and they make changes or suggestions, and then you have a copy editor, and then you have a proofreader. And so it goes through at least 4, sometimes more revisions. I write very fast, and I don't often get the whole draft down before revisions. And what I mean by that is if when I'm stuck, I go back to the beginning, I revise as I go. Oftentimes I've left myself hints of where I wanted to go with something. And so I've done quite a bit of revising. And so when I get to the end, I've already revised heavily. And so I don't have to do as much in that first set of revisions. Some people write the whole piece before revising. Several of you guys are really heavy in dialogue and have to layer in the setting and some of the other elements as you work on your revising. And some will spend years. And I actually have a friend who's multi-published who her first book, she spent several years just on the first opening chapters. So You have to get to the point where you figure out what your process is and you own it. But essentially, it's our job when we're critiquing to find the strengths and the weaknesses, or the strengths and the challenge of a piece, and let the writer fix that. So find your process, own it, live it. And then my editor has a standard disclaimer, and I appreciate that she is this open. Not all editors are. I have a friend whose editor basically, when she says suggest, she suggests something, she's really saying do this. But my editor puts this standard disclaimer in. Just a quick reminder of my feedback disclaimer, which I feel is more important than ever, considering how weird and unpredictable the market has gotten. Take what you can use and discard the rest. I never want to get in the way of your voice and your vision. You know what you're doing. That's where I want you to be, is when you get critiques from another writer, consider that they know what they're talking about. But in the end, it's your piece and you have to decide. Now, I will say, once you get to an editor relationship where you already have a contract, you do have a lot less steps or ways in which to argue, because if you want to continue this publishing relationship, you're going to have to make some changes. So let's talk about ways in which you can workshop a piece, and sometimes the piece may be your own. Take a minute, or with a longer piece, longer than that, to read the scene cold. If you like, you can trade scenes with the writer in the room, or choose to do this for yourself. In the room, we mean in the online room, of course, right now. Once you finish, consider the piece as a whole. What is the story as you read it in the scene? What is the writer trying to accomplish? What do you think are the strengths of the scene? And what do you see as areas for improvement or clarification? Oftentimes, as writers, we get frustrated at our critiquer or our editor because we're thinking they don't get us. Well, guess what? If they don't get us, neither will the reader. And it's our job to be clear. And instead of getting angry at the critiquer or the editor, consider that maybe you haven't done the best job at relating what you're trying to get across, and what can you do to clarify or make it clearer so that the editor or the reader is no longer confused. Over the course of your revisions, you can go back to your original notes from earlier classes or earlier critiques and use them to provoke questions to ask yourself about a chapter, a scene, or a character. When you're working in workshop or critique, you can and should focus on questions. Sometimes asking questions is much more helpful than "that's great" or "I don't like that." Here are some examples of questions you can ask. How well does the piece reflect the needs and expectations of the genre? And I write in both genre fiction and literary fiction, and they each have different expectations. And so you need to know what those expectations are and if the piece reflects the needs or expectations of that genre. If I wrote a mystery and failed to solve the crime, I would be counter the expectations of the reader. It is on you to make sure you read so that you know your genre well enough to know if it's meeting those expectations. Tension. What is the purpose of the scene? Tension it should be something that exists in all scenes. So you need to know what the purpose is, and is there a thread of tension or conflict running through the scene? I don't know if you've ever watched the Twilight movie. I'm going back a few years, but there's a scene in Twilight in the kitchen with Charlie and Bella, and it is the most confusing scene in the entire movie because there seems to be no purpose. She's literally drinking water, and they're just showing that these two are uncomfortable with each other. Maybe that's not the best use of a scene. Does the scene cause a change in the character? That's important to know. Where do you get bored with the scene? And as a writer, you should want to know from your critiquer, where do you get bored? Because that's where you as the writer can improve to get a better reader reaction. Pacing. Is there a balance of fast-paced action scenes, in other words, rising conflict, with periods of reflection, which is really just the try-fail process. So it's this back and forth process of growth for the character, and sometimes they fail and sometimes they succeed and they're learning the skills they need to get to that climactic moment. Are there parts where your reader wants to skip or that you are tempted to skip? And if you're reviewing your own work and you want to skip a place, you might consider deleting it, because if the writer doesn't want to read it, nobody does. Are there parts that go too fast when the reader needs to wallow in the tension or the suspense for a moment longer? Pacing is interesting because the tension is built by making the reader wait, and several of you do this really well, where you have hints of things, but then you keep interrupting the characters and making them do other things on their way to their end goal. And when you do that, you're building the tension and the pacing. Is there a balance? Is there a balance of dialogue and narration that suits the genre and the writer's voice and style? This is where a lot of you will need to work on the second revision or the first revision, because you're very dialogue heavy as you're writing it, and that's fine, but then you need to go back and layer in some of those other elements so that it has a stronger balance. Characters. Some things you can ask about characters are they fully drawn, realistic, and consistent? Do the characters' actions follow their goal and their motivation and the conflict? What character traits are visible in this scene? What traits would add tension to the scene? What does the character notice that another character would not? That's kind of key. If you have a character who's a detective, they're going to notice everything. If you have a character who's delivering groceries to somebody's doorstep, they just want to know if people are home. So what does your character notice? Are the character's emotions clear? Obviously, you don't want to be so bland as to say the character was shocked, but the emotion should be clear through your description. And is the dialogue realistic? Plot development is another area to work, and sometimes literary fiction writers in particular focus on character development, which is part of literary fiction, but you also have to have a plot, and that's where a lot of times you need to spend time in revision so that you make sure once you have your character down that you make sure that there's a story arc involved. Even memoir needs a story arc. So does the plot move from point A to point B? At what part of the plot does this scene take place? In other words, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, is it a turning point? What's the purpose of the particular scene as far as where it sits in the overall goals of your story? Does the end of the scene turn into the action into a different direction? You should have a turning point within each particular scene. How does the scene have a beginning, middle, and an end? And I will say this changes with the marketplace. My editor or my publisher essentially wants us to end on a cliffhanger. It doesn't have to be a major cliffhanger, but it does have to be something that's going to draw the reader to the next chapter. And so they will often have me end the scene at the end of the middle rather than at the very end, because then we can put the end, tag that into the next scene, and keep drawing the reader to turn the pages so they never have a chance to put that book down. How does the scene contribute to character growth? Does the scene end too soon or go on too long? And that's key for your own edification. It's key to know when's a good time to end, and that also has to do with pacing and genre. Emotion. Think back to the post I did on week 2 about emotion, the emotional craft of fiction. Some things you can ask yourself are, what kind of power does each of the main characters have in the scene? Where is there at least one shift in power or even a failed attempt to take power? Very rarely do human beings work cooperatively. Somebody is trying to win somebody over in a way within each scene. And is there a shift in the power base? Where is there at least one moment of making or breaking the emotional connection between the characters? And does it raise the emotional temperature? Is there a mini crisis or a turning point within the scene? Something that is said or done, however minor, after which things cannot go back to quite the way they were before. So if you're evaluating your work, you want to ask those questions. And if you're peer reviewing, you can ask that of the writer so they know that their emotional elements aren't all there and need to be layered in. Writing skills. Does the writer use concrete language? Does the writer tell at times when showing would be more effective? And so for several of you guys, I've mentioned that you're telling the reader and you need to show more. You can't show everything. Your book would be far too long, but you also cannot show everything because at that point you may as well be writing a synopsis instead of a novel. Does the writer show when the moment should be a telling moment? So if your character is just driving in the car from point A to point B, you can probably just tell that. And here's the one that I talk about frequently when I critique you, and that is, does the writer use passive voice? Stephen King has a lot to say about passive voice, and so we're going to look at a couple of his quotes that are from his memoir / how-to book on why and how to use passive voice. And this is strictly and straight from Stephen King. One of my pet peeves has to do with the most basic level of writing, and I want to get it off my chest before we move along. Verbs come in two types, active and passive. With an active verb, the subject of the sentence is doing something. With a passive verb, something is being done to the subject of the sentence. The subject is just letting it happen. You should avoid the passive voice. I'm not the only one who says so. You can find the same advice in the elements of style. And if you don't know what the elements of style is, every writer should have one. It's a very thin volume, but it talks a lot about writing style questions that come up often in critique. I would add, and Stephen King in the next clip, Stephen King does go into this, but I would say there are times when you want passive voice. If you have a character who is refusing to take responsibility and it's early in the book and the character is passive, then passive construction can add to that character development. But let's see how Stephen King continues. I won't say there's no place for passive tense. Suppose, for instance, a fellow dies in the kitchen but ends up somewhere else. The body was carried from the kitchen and placed on the parlor sofa is a fair way to put this. Although was carried and was placed still irk the shit out of me. I accept them, but I don't embrace them. What I would embrace is Freddie and Myra carried the body out of the kitchen and laid it on the parlor sofa. Why does the body have to be the subject of the sentence anyways? It's dead, for Christ's sake. Forget about it. 2 pages of passive voice, just about any business document ever written, in other words, not to mention reams of bad fiction, make me want to scream. It's weak, it's circuitous, it's frequently torturous as well. How about this? My first kiss will be recalled by me as how my romance with Shayna was begun. Oh man. A simpler way to express this idea, sweeter and more forceful as well, might be this. My romance with Shayna began with our first kiss. I'll never forget it. I'm not in love with this because it uses with twice in 4 words, but at least we're out of that awful passive voice. Passive voice, and this comes from Carol Benedict, and there's the link here in the slides. Passive voice refers to a sentence where the subject or thing doing the action is not mentioned in the usual spot for the subject, which is the front of the verb. Instead, it follows the verb, leaving the object of the sentence in the subject's normal place. You can easily identify a passive sentence by its use of the form of the verb to be, and I have given several of you guys links that talk about the to be verbs, followed by a past participle. Often the person or thing doing the action will appear in a phrase that starts with by. So here's a test. The verb test. When you're looking for helping verbs, especially forms of the verb to be in a sentence, these are the ones you're looking for. And obviously you cannot get rid of every single instance of the to be verb because your book would be really, really long, like George R.R. Martin long. But these verbs are indicators that you're using passive voice. And if you know what your crutch is, and we all have one, you can search for that word in your whole document and start to layer in stronger descriptions. So the words that you want to search for are is, am, are, was, were, be, being, been, have, and had. Passive voice clauses usually have one or imply one of these verbs. Now, if you want to take it an easier way and a more memorable way to remember about the to be verbs, try the zombie test. Could you insert the phrase by zombies after the verb? If so, would the sentence still make grammatical sense? If so, you might have passive voice. For instance, the dog was fed by zombies. The beard was long by zombies. In your own work, you can underline or search for passive voice and then figure out where you're using passive voice. Are you using it in description? Are you using it in dialogue? That's often telling about where your crutch is and how you can eradicate it. So as a thing that you might do to practice this, take a paragraph in your work in progress and rewrite it with the knowledge taken from these last two questions just about to be verbs, and see how you can use more active immediate language and concrete language instead of passive to be verbs. Those are all some great questions and tests that you can use to critique one another and to critique yourself. This is what my editor goes through when she looks at my work, and she gives me a document chapter by chapter that goes through some of these questions designed to help me write a better revised version. For those of you who are in a place where you're ready for critique, post in the annotate section of the app and help each other create stronger stories.